So this morning's second panel will focus on implicit bias in healthcare interactions, implications for policy. Again, just as a reminder, you can submit questions through the conference app and in writing starting now. It is my pleasure to introduce Conference Planning Committee member Kenya Beard, who will introduce our speaker and moderate the discussion. Kenya Beard.
Good morning, everybody. And thank you for coming back so promptly. See, that's why I love being a nurse. We are so incredibly smart. We hear the message once, we don't forget. We're quick learners. So it's truly a privilege to be here today, to be a member of the PC, the Planning Committee, and to also moderate this session. Yesterday, we discussed why science and evidence are important to health policy. So let's give ourselves a round of applause if you're addressing the social determinants of health in your research or policy work. Give yourself a round of applause, a hearty round of applause. Now I want you to give yourself a round of applause if you are addressing chronic disease. And now, if your research or policy work focuses on empowering patients, give yourself a round of applause. Dr. Reiss, do you hear that? Now listen again. Give yourself a round of applause if your research or policy work explores what we do as providers that could undermine patient outcomes. We are the bomb.com. Nurses are doing it all. We are not afraid to handle those challenging questions, especially when it comes to bias. 15 years ago, the IOM's bold and provocative report, Unequal Treatment, Confronting Race and Ethnic Disparities. This document taught us that not everyone receives high-quality care. When I entered into nursing in the 80s, I was told it's because the patients need to do this or the patients need to do that. And in the 90s, we said, well, it's the system. We have to change the system. But then the IOM report said, look in the mirror. It is us. We play a huge role in how patient outcomes come to be. So Bill reminded us earlier that there's a very low correlation between knowing what to do and then doing what we need to do. So I need us all to ask ourselves, because according to the IOM, there is evidence that suggests that bias, prejudice, and stereotypes on the part of us healthcare providers may contribute to differences in care. That means that if I go into the emergency room with chest pain and someone who is a different color goes into the emergency room with chest pain, chances are I will be treated less aggressively. When I read that from the Agency of Healthcare Research and Quality, I said there's no way, because we as healthcare providers, we work really, really hard. Raise your hand if you do not believe healthcare providers work hard, especially nurses. So how can that be? And when I asked my colleagues, I said, would you treat me differently? Would you treat me less aggressively? Do you know what they said? Kenya, absolutely not. But then we have these research experts, these psychologists and neuroscientists that say, yes, you will. That you are socialized in a system called the United States that will impact and derail your best intentions and diverge it away from your actions. It is not intentional. But if we don't talk about it, then how does it get better? How do we really improve outcomes and sustain them? Well, luckily for us, we have Dr. Benjamin Reiss here today. He is the VP for Institutional Equity and the Chief Diversity Officer for Duke University and Duke University's health system. He's an avid traveler. He just came back from China. He also advocates for policies that strengthen access and addresses bias around the globe. I asked him this morning over breakfast for a few fun facts. He loves collecting watches. He has hundreds of watches and clocks. So my question, does your wife know, and where do you keep them? Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Reiss.
Thank you. Kenya's my hero. You know, it's great to be here. I think about implicit bias all the time. And I guess I've thought about implicit bias in one form or another for many, many years. I'm at Duke University. I love Duke University. Shout out to Duke University's School of Nursing. And after many years, I often reflect on how I got into this work. I'm in the South now, but I grew up in New York City, as you probably already detect from my accent. Coming from a family that was deeply involved in thinking about higher education, but they had just gotten out of high school themselves. So by the time I got into high school myself, they were drilling into my head, you really have to go to college. Higher education is important. They didn't quite know what that meant, but they drilled into my head it was important. But by the time I got into high school, I was spending most of my time, I don't tell my kids this, not in class, but on sit-ins, picket lines, hanging out with the Black Panthers, etc. And when I graduated with like a C+ average, I was ready for college, so I applied to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton. A couple of state schools, 2 community colleges, and I was absolutely shocked when every single school, for some reason, turned me down. But I was able to start at Bronx Community College for 2 reasons. All right, shout out. At Bronx Community College, although they wouldn't accept me as a full-time student, I started as a non-matriculant student, taking 2 classes, World History 1 and English Composition 1. The other reason, believe it or not, there was no tuition. You know, way back then, in the city university system in New York, you paid maybe $40 a semester in fees, but there was no tuition. So I started my college education. I was working about 10 or 12 hours on the side to help my family out. After the first semester at Bronx Community College, the governor of New York State back then, Governor Rockefeller, said he was going to the state legislature and he was going to ask them to impose $15 a credit. And I just knew $15 a credit, might have to drop out of school or at least get some additional hours of work. I mean, I was in a panic. But I was into my protest demonstrations, sit-in role. So I got some of my friends from Queens College, Brooklyn College. We got our sleeping bags. We got on the New York City subway, went to the governor's office in Manhattan, put our sleeping bags out on the street, and we vowed to sleep there until the governor changed his mind. We slept there for 3 days, March 1965, March 4th, 1965, wow. Governor totally ignored us. Imposed, you know, whatever, $15, $20 a course. But I think back to that time as one of the first efforts I made to co-lead a group of protesters to try to impact equity, fairness, access to higher education. And so over the last half century, I've tried to really stay true to that work, particularly in terms of the values that underlie that work. And lots of things have happened over the years, and I've been fortunate in many ways, but I've really tried to stay true to those values. So when I recently testified before a congressional committee, I was saying the exact same things I was saying back then. Dressed a little bit different, using a little bit of different language, but it was really the same message. One of the things that has changed over that period of 50 years is that the focus on explicit bias back then, you knew where you were accepted, you knew where you could go, you knew what the options were for promotion. It was in your face, people were telling you about it. But one of the changes that has happened over the years is that we have this focus, as Kenya described, on unconscious bias. And I'll flip back and forth between implicit bias, unconscious bias. There certainly are some technical differences, but I'll just, if you allow me, conflate those terms. We've got this focus on unconscious bias. If we think of the way we respond to an individual, a patient, a colleague, a situation, and that response emanating from two broad sources. One, all of the conscious stuff that we're aware of that's based upon our experience, our training, our education. We know that we're sensitive, caring, loving, spiritual people, well-educated, etc. But the other source that contributes to our response, our assessment of people, our decision-making, is out of awareness, is unconscious. And contrary to what many people, myself, believe, most of our response, overwhelmingly, the large part of our response is unconscious, is out of awareness. Now, part of the challenge in modifying behavior is that most of us, myself included, sort of resist in some way, sometimes directly or indirectly, the notion that I'm biased, because I'd like to think that, I've traveled around the world, I'm sensitive, caring, etc., and I'm black, so I've sort of got it. So it's often hard for all of us being professionals in healthcare to think that all of us have the propensity in one situation to be more or less biased unconsciously. And we used to think that this process of unconscious bias really began around adolescence, but we now know that at least the precursors of implicit bias, the foundation for implicit bias, really starts in infancy. When we see the kind of tendencies and propensities of infants. For example, we know that at about 4 or 5 months, if you track the eyes of infants, they will stare longer at female faces if a woman has been the primary caregiver. Not implicit bias, but it's the beginning of a kind of tendency and inclination. At about 9 or 10 months of age, tracking the eyes of infants, they will stare longer at faces that have the same or similar complexion as the primary caregiver. Again, not implicit bias, but it's the beginning of a kind of tendency. And we know that shortly thereafter, 10 or 11 months of age, infants will stare longer at faces that are speaking in the same or similar language as the primary caregiver. Again, not implicit bias, it's the beginning of this tendency. But shortly thereafter, as kids are, toddlers, we begin to see them taking in this stuff from the environment. As Kenya said, from all the stuff in the United States, and it certainly occurs around the world, about who's good, who's bad, who's skilled, who's dangerous, based on the way they look, the way they sound, their weight, their perceived sexual orientation, etc. We know, for example, in some painful research, they'll show 4 to 6-year-old kids a picture of a swing. Behind the swing will be a child who's white. On the ground in front of the swing will be a child who's black. And they'll ask 4 to 6-year-olds to make up a story. When the white child is behind the swing, black child is on the ground, the story is more often the child fell off the swing, the other child is coming to help. When the picture is reversed and the black child is behind the swing, the stories are more often the child pushed the other child off the swing. Among kids who have friends of all backgrounds, parents say their best friend is a different race, cultural background, etc. Because we know that that process develops, that wonderful process develops parallel to kids learning about the environment and all of the stuff that we put out there. I don't want to inundate you with research, but particularly in the area of bias, or when we talk about diversity, it's important to understand that it's not because we want to be nice, touchy-feely, wonderful people, and that's true, but it's because the ways in which implicit bias impacts our work really is scientific, based in research. You know, there's some other painful research took place in 2016 at New York University. So they had about 400 youngsters from 5 to 7 years of age, 200 boys, 200 girls. They exposed them to 3 studies that were related. So in the first study, they showed them photographs of people, and they said, who do you think is very, very smart? Boys or girls, men or women? Second piece of research related to that, they then read them stories. And they said, who's very, very intelligent? Boys or girls, men or women? And in the third piece of research, they had them match traits to people. And again, the question was, who's very, very smart? Who's very, very intelligent? When they asked 5-year-olds, 5-year-old boys selected boys as being very, very smart, very, very intelligent. 5-year-old girls selected girls as being very, very smart, very, very intelligent. But when they asked 6 and 7-year-olds, 6 and 7-year-old boys selected boys as being very, very smart, very, very intelligent. 6 and 7-year-old girls also selected boys as being very, very smart, very, very intelligent. And when you read this research, the researchers hypothesized that perhaps when kids start going to school and they spend more time online, they see the gender of the principal, they start reading books or having books read to them, so many of the books, so much of what's online perpetuates gender inequality, inequity. And so at an early age, we have this stuff in the environment that begins to send messages to kids almost like, osmosis. They take it in, and we see bias developing. I mean, as soon as we see someone or hear their voice, we have a first impression. I mean, that's how powerful a process is. Let me ask you for a moment, if you just take out a piece of paper, you can do this on your phone or on a computer, just number 1 to 7 down the left-hand side. In a moment, 7 photographs will appear on the screen. They'll each be on the screen for about 8 seconds. I'd like for you to write down the first 2 words that come to mind when you see each photograph. Try not to think about it, reflect on it, analyze, etc. Whatever the first 2 words are that come to mind. Okay, here we go. Okay, time to stop moving. Okay, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. Turn to the other people at your table and share the words that you associate with the pictures. Okay, time is up. Time is up. Ladies and gentlemen, time is up.
You know what works?
What works?
If you hear my voice, clap once. If you hear my voice, clap twice. That always works.
Authority. The voice of authority. If we were in a workshop, we would then discuss our first impressions. People would talk about it. We'd talk about what cues contributed to your first impression. But trust me, I've done this a lot across the country. Let me tell you what some of the associations are. So the top left, people often say grandmother, old, you got it, mom. On the right, for some reason, I get a lot of intense, arrogant, weird, okay. Going down on the left side, hardworking, Asian, telephone operator. Okay. Moving over to the right, for whatever reason, blonde, mom, I get a lot of soccer mom, okay. Lower left, I get old, 1940s lady, grandmother. In the middle, bottom middle, I get weird, sometimes 1970s person. Okay. Lower right, people often say Robin Williams. Yeah, okay. And if it's not Robin Williams, it's a professor. Yeah. I'm going to give you the answers in a minute. But before I give you the answers, let me reiterate, everybody has a first impression. As soon as you see someone, hear their voice, smell them, etc., and we would like to think, I would like to think, well, I have a first impression, then I get additional data so I can reach a more informed conclusion. The reality is your more informed conclusion is influenced by your first impression. 0.5% influence, 5%, 10, 20, I mean, depending on the situation, the context, who you are, what your experience is, but nobody's first impression is 100% objective. And we bring our own personal and cultural experiences to our first impressions. If we were doing this in Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Bahrain, that cultural context would contribute to our first impression. And then there would be the personal idiosyncratic response. Let me give you the answers. You can't take back what you said now. Okay, top left-hand corner. The grandmother is Dorothy Mary Crowfoot Hodgkins, who was a British chemist who developed protein crystallography, for which he won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1964.
Wow.
Nobody's ever said scientist. Okay, so the weird, intense person, the top right, Martine Rothblatt, a transgender woman who is CEO of United Therapeutics. Quote, "I can't claim that what I have achieved is equivalent to what a woman has achieved. For the first half of my life, I was male. Rothblatt has 4 kids and is still married to a wife of more than 36 years. Hardworking Asian woman, a telephone operator, is Xian Wu, a Chinese-American female experimental physicist. Dr. Wu upended a law of physics, but her findings were credited to 2 male theoretical physicists. Dr. Wu went on to win a Nobel Prize in 1957 and often has the nickname of the First Lady of Physics. Okay, the blonde soccer mom. Anne Ferrin, an English soccer referee, became the first woman to referee in a UK soccer league in 2010. Ferrin has a degree in economics and works as an accountant. She has refereed soccer since age 14. Okay, lower left, the older 1940s grandmother. Okay. Carolyn Grillis, imprisoned at Sydney's Long Bay prison in 1947 after being convicted of murdering 4 family members, including her 87-year-old stepmother and sister-in-law. Several other suspicious deaths were probably the result of tea parties where the tea was spiked with rat poison. Hey. And okay, so the 1970s looking guy in the middle. So that person is David Warren, Melbourne Aeronautical Research Laboratory scientist. He invented the world's first black box that recorded vital airplane data. It went from a single prototype to a mandatory part of every commercial airline. And then Robin Williams, better known as the professor. All right, can't take back what you said now. So Robin Williams is really Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman, who was an English doctor and is one of the world's most prolific serial killers in recorded history. Proven to have been responsible for over 250 murders. So Dr. Shipman was putting stuff in the IV. And there was an attorney. She was taking care of her mother's affairs as the mother got older. Her mother died. As she went to manage her funds, it became clear somebody was siphoning off money. That led to the investigation of Dr. Shipman, exhuming lots of bodies, and at least 250 people he'd killed. Now, people tend not to see him, well, they never see him as a murderer because, you know, we all of us respond to cues. The way someone looks, the way someone sounds. And we bring to that assessment our own stuff, our own background, everybody. I'll give you an example of how we respond to the sound and accents. So there's some research, it's about 12 years old, but I suspect it still holds up. So they take a group of people and they watch a screen and they see about a dozen people, they're actors, speaking in different accents. And then they ask the group, what accent do you think is most pleasing? And 90% of the time it's the British accent. French is second. Person with the British accent's a tall white gentleman in a black suit, top hat. Second part of the experiment, they take another group in another room, and they're actors reading the same script, different accents. Only the person with the British accent now is a, quote, large black woman from the British West Indies. the British accent tends to come out ranked third as most pleasant. And we think we're seeing the interaction of gender, weight, race, etc., culture. So I present this research at the University of Coventry, about 2 hours, 3 hours outside of London. People are looking around in the room and they say, well, Dr. Reiss, do you mean a West Coventry accent or East Coventry accent? East London accent? And what I didn't say was it all sounds the same to me. I mean, well, that's my bias. One of the tips, it might sound simplistic, to manage implicit bias is as you become more conscious of a blind spot, a tendency, a propensity, either because someone points it out or you, through reflection, recognize some repetitive behavior, some association making, is to then be aware proactively of when you're in that situation so you can modify or manage your behavior. Proactively be aware of your tendency when you're in that situation so you can modify or manage your behavior. So when I was flying here last night, I got on the plane, look in the cockpit, and so there is a quote, young woman, as a pilot. So I immediately say to myself, don't go there, this bias. So that's fine. About 20 minutes later, we're in rough air. Immediately, I started thinking about the gender of the pilot. I mean, that's how insidious the process is. But if I had to make some judgment, do some task, make some assessment, I would hope that with that insight about my own bias, I would factor that in to my vigilance, and I would hopefully eliminate any potential for that bias. But it takes that kind of recognition. I got lots of biases I can tell you about. I've won, over the last several years, 2 pretty prestigious awards around my commitment to ability disability. And I oversee a health system, 3 hospitals, clinics, etc. But I do remember having a temporary employee in my office who was in a wheelchair. And she said to me one day, Ben, when we're going down the hall and we're going around a corner, you have this tendency of putting your hand in the back of my wheelchair and just pushing it a little bit. And if I need your help, I'll ask for it. So I went home and said, what's the big deal? She's being oversensitive, etc. Then a few days later, I thought, well, if I'm really going to be honest with myself, there have been some occasions when I've connected someone in a wheelchair with inherently needing my help. And what's further back there in my mind and harder to access are those occasions when I've connected someone being in a wheelchair with their cognitive ability. While I work in a healthcare system and win all the awards, etc., but I've been influenced by lots of stuff in the environment. So my business card happens to be in Braille as one of the ways of helping me to stay focused on that potential blind spot, that tendency, that propensity to respond to people who have at least a visible disability in a way that says more about what's in my head as opposed to what's happening with them. So in healthcare, there's been lots of research on implicit bias. Some of the seminal research was done by Professor Kevin Schulman, who did it while he was at another university, but Kevin is now at Duke University. And in this seminal research, he went to a large convention with physicians. This is in 1999. And he took about 720 physicians responded to this research design that he had. And he showed them pictures and photographs, and the photographs were of patients. Then they watched this video. So the video showed the patient, really an actor, who was talking about pains in their chest radiating out into the left arm. Lots of data was on the screen. Clearly that there was some cardiac blockage. Some of the people were watching a video of a black actor, some a white actor, some male, some female. Then he asked them, what's the treatment of choice? And back then it was cardiac catheterization. And what he found was that there were fewer referrals for that appropriate treatment for the women and for the black actors. Among physicians who said, all of the right things, I don't care about someone's race or gender, and they probably don't consciously, but all of us to a lesser or greater extent are influenced by implicit bias. And it's not only, the kind of visible things that we say, the kind of decisions that we make that seem clear to others, but it can even be in our nonverbal behavior. There was this study, and this is a small sample size, it was done in Philadelphia. There were only 33 physicians, but they were asked to, go into this room, you'll see a patient in the bed, terminally ill, they knew it was an actor, and just interact with the patient. Half the time it was a black patient, actor. The other half of the time it was a white actor in the bed. So all the physicians probably recognized or thought it had something to do with what they would say. And so virtually everybody went into the room, said sensitive things to this person in the bed. They didn't know that there was a screen. Behind the screen there were people who were watching through this one-way mirror who were judging their nonverbal behavior, and they were being recorded. And what they found was, they said sensitive things to everyone, but if the patient was black, they stood further away from the bed. If the patient was white, they stood closer, often touching the arm or the shoulder of the patient. So when you read this research, you can even see the photographs. One of the photographs has a black patient, actor, and a black physician. And he's standing further away from the bed. All of us socialize in the same society. So when you read research about implicit bias in race and gender, there often is some difference, but often it's not statistically significant because we're all socialized in the same society. So implicit bias, particularly in healthcare, impacts lots of areas of our decision making. And if you look at some of the survey researches that look at 50, 60, 70 pieces of research and try to detect trends, it appears that implicit bias accounts for 3, 4, 5% of the variance, if you will, in decision making in healthcare. But if you think of 3 or 4% bias at every stage of the healthcare encounter, going to the front desk, going in to see a provider, speaking to someone, diagnosis, treatment, etc. Implicit bias is a critical element, at least in 3 areas of healthcare. So one, in terms of communication, everything that's said verbally, all of the nonverbal behavior. Secondly, its impact on decision making. Everything from who you include, who you decide to include in healthcare, what you provide as treatment, how you convey that, insurance issues, a whole bucket of decisions. And then thirdly, the whole area of policy. I think specifically in terms of my work, what are the policies around implicit bias education? What are the policies around practice? The development of required protocols, for example. So communication, decision making, and that bucket of policy issues. So I would give you 3 recommendations, and if we had time, we can discuss them and deconstruct them. But simply put, education. So we know that, as Kenya indicated, being aware of the area of implicit bias and going through some kind of formal education is helpful. Caveats. One caveat is the education has to be substantial. And another arena, I'm working on some research to try to figure out what do we mean by substantial education. And then the other caveat is the education has to be more than one time. There has to be some kind of follow-up, and two types of follow-up, not the only two, are case studies where you have the opportunity and the challenge of applying what you've learned about implicit bias to hopefully realistic case studies. And then also the use of professional actors, where you get a chance in realistic scenarios to interact with actors and to practice implicit bias. Also, in the bucket of education, and it's also a policy issue, in what ways is the curriculum not only sensitive to implicit bias, but in what ways is implicit bias education woven through the curriculum? So it could be a separate course, or it could be a real deliberate way of weaving it through an entire curriculum. Another policy intervention can be, and we're doing this at Duke University, and I admit we're doing it partially. Partially, I mean every new faculty member in arts and sciences, that's about 85% of our faculty. We haven't done it consistently throughout all of our professional schools, but every faculty member in arts and sciences goes through an hour and a half of implicit bias training in their first week on campus. Nobody thinks it's a cure-all. No one thinks it's going to replace a focus on institutionalized sexism, homophobia, racism, because those need to be attacked via a whole host of complex interventions, but we think it's critical both in terms of increasing education of new faculty members, but also the kind of message that it sends. Everyone who's on a search committee, a faculty search committee, goes through an implicit bias workshop. We started out a couple of years requiring it of every chair of a committee, but now everyone on the committee. And again, it's on arts and sciences, and we're spotty throughout the professional schools, but we're going to get there. And, unlike what I anticipated, there's almost no pushback. In fact, people on search committees who are out of town or traveling, when they come back, they call me up and say, "Ben, can you do it just for me?" And so it's becoming so much of the culture that it's a policy intervention that we think is having an impact. And we're doing some research. We just had a big research meeting yesterday. We have a large grant where we're looking at the impact of implicit bias education. I mean, it's because the jury is still out in terms of just what kind of education results in what kind of change, and if it does result in change, how do you measure it, how long does it last, et cetera. The second recommendation I would make is about reminders or cues. So once someone goes through an educational module, we know about education. If you don't apply it or you don't get reminders, follow-up, that original education can fade. So there's a whole bunch of things I've been trying in terms of cues. So one simplistic thing, I have these little laminated cards. On one side it has some aspects of implicit bias, flip side it has some strategies. I ask people to hold on to these as reminders. Another cue we've tried. So we did, with a colleague, a half-day workshop for physicians who screen applicants to our School of Medicine, and then the other half who do the actual multiple mini interviews. The end of the half-day workshop, I handed out a piece of paper that had like 20 words and concepts I used in the workshop. And I asked them to circle 3 and only 3 things that would remind them of the workshop 90 days in the future. They did that. I collected all the papers, took it home, did a frequency analysis, came up with the 5 things they said would remind them of the workshop. And we made it into a laminated poster to put it in the wall of the room where they gather before they go in to do the interviews. as a cue, as a reminder. When they go in to do the interviews, by the way, they're given an iPad that has information about the candidate. Unfortunately, the iPad has the photograph also. And you can imagine, or I can imagine, the possibility of bias when you see the photograph of someone before you go in and interview them. But we're hoping that on the iPads we can make a screensaver that has the 5 words that they said would remind them. And then there's some work I'm doing looking at whether there's some things you can do with cell phones that can send messages as cues, as reminders. Then the last cue is, I personally have been trying this. There's no research behind it. I don't know if this works, but on my telephone in my office, I have a little round yellow dot, a little post-it dot that has the letters IB. Every time I pick up my phone, I think about implicit bias. You know, it's what they call the PREMAC principle. You take a high-frequency occurrence, like picking up your phone, and you match it with something you also want to be high frequency. You know, it's what's behind putting the warnings on pack of cigarettes for smokers. Every time you take a pack of cigarettes out, high-frequency behavior, you see the warning. By the way, I change my dot and the color of the dot every month or so I don't get habituated to the color. But it's a cue and a reminder, and I think about implicit bias every time I pick up my phone. And then the third bucket of recommendations is simply around developing protocols so that you can tighten up the kind of decision-making process. You know, can you appropriately mention just so much research about the difference in opioids distribution in emergency departments to people with chronic pain who are black or white. And black folks get less painkillers for seemingly the same level of pain. And so when a nurse or a doctor interacts with someone and has a conversation, boy, it leaves room for bias. So lots of hospitals, in fact, most hospitals now have a simple protocol. So, for example, on a 10-point Likert scale, if your pain is a 7, everybody gets the same amount of painkiller. Without that protocol, left to someone's kind of gut feeling after speaking with someone, it opens the door for potential bias. So lastly, let me leave you with a suggestion for a 90-day plan. Okay. So in the next 90 days, I would suggest and ask that you either put a dot on your phone or put a book on your desk that can serve as a reminder, or maybe a poster on the wall, but do something that creates that kind of reminder about implicit bias. Secondly, designate a 7-day period where you pay attention to the things that you say, the way you assess someone as soon as you see them. Because it's kind of weird to think about everything you say and do all the time, but take a period of time where you focus on your assumptions. I mean, I was doing this a couple of months ago. I got an opportunity to do implicit bias work with probably one of the largest law firms in America. In fact, every session was beamed to 4 places around the world. So I had all of these conference calls leading up to doing this work, law firms in New York City. On the conference calls with 2 partners of the law firm, 2 associates, and 2 legal assistants. How much time I got? 2 minutes? 0? Okay. Let me just quickly finish this story. So I had all these conference calls. Day comes when I fly to New York City to do this workshop, 37th floor. They put me in this conference room, and the people walk in. And I tried to, in my own mind, decide who was the partner, who was the associate, who was the legal assistant. I was about 50% correct, race, gender, weight, dress, etc. But it was during this 7-day period when I was looking at my own behavior and trying to pay attention to my assumptions. Thursday, schedule a lunch with a colleague to discuss your assumptions. 4, take the implicit association test. If you've taken it, take some more. And lastly, Google a couple of articles. There's so many articles, both popular and scientific, online, but it's a way of increasing your education because the goal is responding to people, to patients, in a way that says more about them than the stuff that's rolling around in your own heads. Thank you.
Was that not awesome?
Thank you.
Ben, thank you so much for your transparency and your authenticity. Sharing your personal stories about bias really helps us to say, you know what, if you can do that, we can do it too. But it's difficult.
Yeah.
You know, I think about what just happened to Megyn Kelly. And I'm not here to say if what she did was right or wrong, but I am concerned about the impact of a person saying something about race on the air, and then within 48 hours they are fired. What effect does that have on us when we want to have a conversation about race? I would be afraid to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that it might mute conversations. You saw it didn't work out well for her, and you want me to talk about it? But if we don't talk about it, they say that medical errors are the 3rd leading cause of death. What are we doing differently so that our students are not the reason why medical errors become the leading cause of death? And if we know that bias plays a role and that we do have biases just by being human, how do we get in front of that?
Yeah. Well, everything you said about open dialogue, reflection, acknowledgement of our own frailty, if you will, as basic as that may seem, is really an important foundation. But you know, the thing you said earlier about the challenge of having conversations about diversity, implicit bias, race, particularly in the national environment that we're in now, is a challenge. You know, on one side, you often have white people who say, if I say something that just doesn't sound like it's in agreement with everything the black people say, I'm labeled a racist. You'll have many black people saying, I'm not going to say anything because once I say something, I'm accused of turning everything into race issue, so I'm just going to shut up. And so I think that, it may seem simplistic, it's important to create the kind of environment over time where people take some risk. Because there's a tendency among people, myself included, to conflate the comments that people make, like Kelly's comment. So some people will say something that's inappropriate, racially, sexually, et cetera, and they do that in the context of being a major figure for social justice, someone who's worked on civil rights for ages, et cetera, and they slip and say something, slip and use a word. You know, I was sharing earlier that there was a time, not too long ago, when I would slip sometimes and say, you know, someone's just got to whip somebody into shape. I've been doing this for 50 years. Slip. Then there are other people who might say the exact same thing, and they say it as a result of lack of knowledge or ignorance. They just don't know the historical context. Then thirdly, there can be people who say the exact same thing, and they're avowed racists. The danger, one of the dangers, is that we conflate those three and then respond to anyone who says something as if they're all racist. And I think we need to have a deeper conversation so we can ferret out whether it's, you know, a mistake, which needs to be responded to, but we don't respond to, I think, a kind of slip of the tongue, so to speak, in the same way that we respond to someone who has a well-developed belief system that's sexist or racist.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the consequences for the actions are different depending on the context. We have a couple of questions from the participants. Two of them are the same, really. What are some good ways to teach students bias?
Well, you know, one of the ways that, and you probably sensed it in my presentation, I think we teach bias, is in the conversation, in the dialogue, taking some risk to be vulnerable so that we model things for students that we want them to take in. Because we know this about child development is not only what you say to your kids as they grow up, but it's what they observe. And so in addition to fermenting the kind of open dialogue that I've been talking about, you know, modeling for our students, our own children, our colleagues, our friends, the kind of response to bias, to issues of gender, race, that we want to see more frequently. But it's, you know, I admit it's hard because the other thing that's modeled for all of us is a kind of national dialogue or lack thereof. So I want to recognize that we're talking about all of this in a particular context, and we can't forget that. That's important. I was in Australia a short while ago, and so the context of the Aboriginal population, I mean, that influences implicit bias. There's bias there like anywhere else. A few weeks later, I go to Israel. There's implicit bias, but the context is that it's primarily against ultra-Orthodox Jews and the Arab population. And so in the United States, we have a historical context related to race and gender, and then we have all this stuff that's happening currently in our national context.
So our initial, and I know I'm going to be mindful of time, so we only have one last comment, but you said that our initial impression really informs our beliefs. And knowing that, we also seek to affirm our own reality. So how do we really get ahead of this when we are designing and constructing policies that are going to have a huge impact on healthcare? How do we make sure that the policies we create really consider our bias?
Yeah. Well, I think in the development of policy, and this goes back to the earlier comments about reading stuff that just reinforces, confirmation bias, that in developing policy, I think it's incumbent upon us to look at all perspectives, particularly those perspectives that we think don't really matter or we don't agree with. And so part of what can facilitate that is groups that make policy. Those groups need to be as diverse as possible along a whole host of dimensions. We know in the academy, for example, at Duke University, if you have student involvement in a committee and the students involved are like the president of the student association, that's different than having that student and also the student who just took over your administration building. Because you want to get all those perspectives, not only the ones that reinforce what you think is the right direction or the right beliefs, but those who have other perspectives. And so in the development of policy, it's critical to involve a wide range of viewpoints and perspectives.
So we have to be courageous leaders,
Courageous.
who intentionally invite people to challenge us and to tell us, no, I think it should be or could be, just to say something different.
Got it.
So if everyone at the table is saying the same thing, you want to end that?
You know you're in trouble.
Thank you, Dr. Reiss. Please don't go. Karen Cox is coming back, so please don't leave yet.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reiss, for that very thought-provoking talk. And he told me before that he did a 2.5-hour talk in 1 hour, but I think we really got the important points. And thank you, Dr. Beard, for moderating this session. We appreciate it.